floor to questions, comments from, yes, and if you would also identify yourself as you make those comments because this is being recorded. Yes, Mr. Berkey.
My name is Javed Berkey. A couple of questions. One, you gave us some numbers, and I was doing some arithmetic based on those numbers. It seems to me that total employment in the government service accounts for something like 3 to 3.5% of the total labor force. How does that compare with other countries in the region, Pakistan, India, and so on and so forth? The context for this question is that, as Iftikhar pointed out, Bangladesh has done extremely well in terms of establishing its role in non-government organizations, BRAG, Grameen, and there are several other NGOs. What is the employment in the NGO sector, and how does it compare with the employment in the public sector? Then on governance, I have an issue, and I have looked at Pakistan's experience in governance. In Pakistan, as in most other developing countries, the focus has been on what I will call ex post accountability. In other words, you begin to worry about corruption after it has already taken place. Pakistan, as you know, has something called Accountability Bureau, National Accountability Bureau. It has not been very effective in reducing corruption because it gets into the act when an act has been already committed and is usually, politicized and so on and so forth. So my question is, are you putting more emphasis on what I would call ex ante accountability? While government servants are engaged in providing services, are they being properly watched in order to make sure that there's compliance to rules and so forth? And are there systems which would ensure that? Finally, you made the point that in Bangladesh, civil service is itself very involved in developing its own self, reforming and so on. Is that wise? I mean, can civil service really do it? Shouldn't this be done by outside factors, maybe politicians and so on, rather than civil service? And one final thing. You gave some very interesting data on the composition of how the government operates and what are its various parts and so on. I was just wondering whether a country with 165 million people can be managed as a unitary system. And isn't it now the time to get, you talked about devolution. Is this now a time to think about not only administrative devolution, but also political devolution, that you create systems to which politicians are responsive at levels lower than, say, ad hoc?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, sir. You have raised a number of very relevant and interesting issues. I'm not prepared with all the data, but I can respond to some of the points that you have already made. I don't have the comparative figures with regard to the percentage of civil employees or government employees as part of the total workforce. But I can tell you that, government is growing, but the private sector in Bangladesh is also growing faster compared to the government. And the NGOs, of course, they have good experiences in working at the grassroots. But most of the NGO functions are project-based. the number or the percentage of their the permanent employees is not very big. In government, we have more permanent employees. So, but I don't have the figures, the percentage of NGO employees in the workforce, or the percentage of the government employees compared to other countries of the region. Then you spoke about the exposed accountability, or X or NT, incidents, etc. Now, yes, of course, that's why the NIS was, National Integrated Strategy, was adopted by the cabinet to prevent corruption. It's better to prevent it than to, of course, if there is an offense, we have to investigate, we have to arrange for trial and punish the offender. But it's always better to prevent corruption. And also some other interventions are playing very significant role in this regard. One is the RTI, Right to Information Act. I must admit that the implementation, the law is very good, but implementation is not, the progress of implementation so far is not very significant. But it is also taking place slowly but steadily. But this experience of other countries, particularly neighboring countries, have shown that if successful implementation of RTI can also prevent wrongdoings in public life. Another institution is also important in this regard, the National Human Rights Commission, particularly in dealing with the law enforcement agency and others. Human Rights Commission also is also playing an important role. But I think the most important role is being played by the media in Bangladesh. Although media is not always on, each and every report is not objective, but media also plays a very important, in a sense that they are, government holders of any public office, maybe a politician, a civil servant, are very careful in discharging their responsibilities, because media will not spare them. So these are improving, governance. These are reducing corruption in government. That's my understanding. Now, of course, you had been a very veteran civil servant yourself. Civil service was for long considered a self-serving institution. So if civil service pursues reform agenda, what's the intention behind it? It can be also a self-serving initiative. Yes, it can be. But what I feel, I think many of our colleagues feel that, I remember Sheikh Mohammed of Dubai hosted a leadership summit, and he, about 10 years ago, he said to his fellow Arab leaders, if you do not change, you will be changed. It's like this. So this is applicable to civil servants as well. If we do not change, we will be changed, in a sense that our functions will be taken away by others. So for our survival, for our vibrant role in public life, we have to change ourselves, we have to reform ourselves. This feeling works in the new generation of civil servants. So I think this is one of the reasons why civil service is positive to reforms in governance and administration, because that also leads to their existence, their role in the society. Now, regarding this structure, we have a unitary system. So far my knowledge, there is one political party or one political leader, General Ershad. General Ershad has explicitly advocated for the federal system. He is in favor of upgrading the administrative divisions in the provinces with their own legislative assemblies and governments. But other political parties, the two major political parties, are not, they have not shown any interest in that. So for my experience, I can tell you that in Bangladesh, this federal structure may not be very suitable. Why? Bangladesh is a very homogeneous country. The ethnicity, language, this economic life is very homogeneous, and also it's a compact country. It's not very big, 141,000 square kilometer, and now we have developed a very extensive road network. Its communication is also good, road communication, telecommunication, but the government is too big. We have to deal with this. So I think the best solution would be to strengthen the local governments. All the three tiers of government, the district council, sub-district council, the union councils. For example, education. The government can retain the higher education and the curriculum, policy, etc. Secondary education can go to the district councils. Primary education can go to the sub-district councils. The mass education, adult literacy can go to the union council. In roads is also possible everywhere. So strengthening the local governments in real sense could be an answer to this over-centralized system of governance.
If I may interject here also, in Bangladesh, in the absence of any feudal structure or class structure in a traditional sense, the civil services have sometimes played the role of an agent for change, because civil service represents the broad middle class also. I mean, what used to be called in Calcutta the Bhadralok type, the middle classes of Bengal. For instance, in '71, it did play a political role. Civil service was a very major vanguard in the sort of independence movement. You mentioned ICT as a specific sector in which the civil service is playing a very major role, and that is also a fact. In all the analysis and the numbers, one has of course left out the uniformed services, which also numbers nearly 1 million all told. I mean, if you include the police, etc. So they are also a major agent of change. So in many ways, they see themselves as performing a progressive role by effecting these changes, not just for survival, as you say, but also as a part of a total sort of consciousness, national consciousness. So it is not a meritocracy in this way that Singapore is, perhaps, but in many ways it is representative of the urges of the common man. And that is why it sees itself as an instrument or agent of change. As for devolution in terms of creating new provinces, yeah, I agree with the Cabinet Secretary, because I think that will lead to unnecessary creation of these separatist tendencies and creating them when they do not actually exist, you see. I don't see too much of a problem if the governance is devolved in the way that you're suggesting and the way that we've always thought in Bangladesh. We have in the past increased the number of administrative units, but not given them any kind of a political cognomen. So that is important, to retain the single structure. If we have two houses in the parliament at some point in time, maybe one can think of a further devolution. Right now, it works, and what isn't broken, I mean, need not necessarily be fixed. Okay, for Sojin and then Mr. Suryanarayana. Professor Riaz Hassan and Professor Rahul Mukherjee is raring to go. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Sojin, visiting research fellow at ISAS. Well, my question is for Bangladesh. What is the importance of building democratic culture to produce higher level of governance? Well, if we look at the strong states in East Asia, like Singapore or South Korea, well, when we discuss these countries, the fairly good level of governance, which led finally to economic growth, is deeply associated with more meritocracy, with very strong leadership, right? But in what context in Bangladesh, I mean, does this democratic culture, producing this democratic culture, have importance? I mean, what is the meaning of your,
Yeah, I
the
got it. I
concept?
got it.
Yeah.
Do you want to take another question with it so we cover two, or do you want to answer this?
I'd like to answer that. Was it
All right.
forget? Yeah. Yes. South Asia has I think, quite rich, long and rich political history. The first political party was established about 150 years ago, right? The Indian National Congress. So, political life is very vibrant in South Asia in general, and also in Bangladesh. And not only the political parties, the professional organizations are also very vibrant. Sometimes they behave in a quasi-political manner. So it's important to involve all stakeholders in the decision-making process. Only then you can expect to make an acceptable, widely acceptable decision. And acceptable decisions are likely to be easily implementable. But if you ignore the stakeholders while making decisions, this may be challenging to implement, and this may not sustain. So, of course, a strong leadership is very important for continuity, for visionary decisions. But if you fail to mobilize support from across the board, then it will be very challenging to sustain. That's the point. That's why I feel that developing democratic culture is important.
Mr. P.S. Suryanarayana.
Yeah, I'm also from the institute here. Sir, Bangladesh politics is deeply polarized. Everyone knows that. How much of that is reflected in the civil service? Or as the head of the civil service, do you have problems of dealing with Awami League civil servants versus BNP civil servants on a day-to-day basis? And secondly, in Bangladesh, the army has played a critical role in politics at one stage or the other. And right now in India, there is a debate about the salary structures of the civil servants versus the salary structures of the army, the military. Do you have a similar problem in Bangladesh? Are the civil servants paid better than the military personnel, or vice versa? And is that an issue? And if so, how are you solving that? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll be less than honest if I do not accept that there's a strong political polarization in Bangladesh. Let's take a historical fact as well. As I indicated, in political front, there are differences, how we identify ourselves as a nation, how we evaluate our national leaders, the philosophical part of politics. So if the politics is polarized, then it's quite natural that this may affect the civil service in this way or other. But let me tell you that this is well managed. That polarization is not very, not very explicit, or that doesn't create any obstacle on delivery of services. And most of the civil servants, I can tell you, that are not involved in I think our conduct rules do not allow civil servants to align with any political party. So explicitly, there is no polarization. Implicitly, there could be. But let me tell you that implicitly also, majority of civil servants are neutral, still neutral, mainly because we inherit a political career structure in civil service. Historically, our civil service had been an apolitical
He looked at
entity.
me for a reason.
Yes. This is there could be some polarizations implicitly, but that doesn't affect the performance of the civil service in true sense. And as I said, on economic issues, there is an underlying implicit consensus among major political parties, and civil servants are basically they implement the policies of the government, and since there is no drastic change in the economic policies, in the social sector policies, there is no problem of continuity in performance of the civil service. Yeah. And the role of IS, yes, we had two military, two regimes, the military interventions, but by now Bangladesh Army has been able to establish its credibility as a professional, not only army, the armed forces has been able to establish its credibility with regard to professionalism. It's no longer, even it's not perceived as a politicized or some sort of entity, and nobody perceives any political ambition of the civil services. And with regard to the pay structure, we also follow a unified pay structure, and that was initiated in 1973. Before independence, there are 2,200 pay scales, pay grades in the public service, public sector. In the Pay Commission of 1972 came up with only 10 grades in the public service. In 77, it was made 20 grades. Since then, we are following 20 grades. Defense services have also separate grades, but in line with the same. The top grade and the lower are the same. So I think there's a balance. Civil service doesn't receive more than the defense, or defense doesn't receive more than the civil service. So pay and allowances, incentives is not an issue at all in Bangladesh.
Yeah.
There's no commotion.
Just one interjection here. You see, as we have often discussed here, the broad political dichotomy in Bangladesh is between what we call the Muslimness and the Bengaliness. And in some ways, the two major political parties tend to, I do not say they necessarily do, tend to represent one or the other of these value systems. So if an individual is a Bangladeshi, whether he's a civil servant or not, it is almost well nigh impossible for him or her not to have predilections leaning towards one or the other side. I mean, it is futile to deny that he or she would have these predilections. But the way you explained it, I agree with you entirely. You see, it's the role of the civil servant. The role of the civil servant is almost apolitical, because he is or she is involved in development activities, implementations of rules, etc., and does not leave much scope for the politics to play a role. It is also a fact, and this is almost sociological, it's also a fact because the civil servants are the best educated element in the community. It's almost it's an inexorable process that after they have retired from government service, and as you have seen, they retire rather early, 55 at one stage and 59 now.
No.
Earlier on it was 55. Almost invariably they flow into the political stream. So many major political leaders of Bangladesh have come from either the civil service or the military, which is no different from other Asian societies. Perhaps a little different from India, because India has evolved a separate this thing of its own. But Bangladesh in that way is somewhat similar to Pakistan or other Asian countries. Yes, Professor Hassan.
Thank you very much. Riaz Hassan from the Institute. Thank you very much for your very informed, useful, interesting overview of the government. When I was in the first batch of the interwing exchange scholars who went from West Pakistan to East Pakistan, and I was told that by my at that time East Pakistani, now Bangladeshi friends, that you have that's me, the West Pakistan had agriculture and you have culture, that's the Bangladeshi culture. And I hope that still is the case, that Bangladesh is still thriving this culture. Now I have two questions. One is partly related to what Dr. Iftikhar Chaudhry just said. I mean, there have been a remarkable achievement that Bangladesh has displayed in terms of improving quality of life of its people. In fact, it's one of the best in South Asia. But in recent years, there have been this rather unfortunate and very gruesome murders of bloggers. Is this just the tip of the iceberg or just an isolated incident? My second observation is that I have been looking at the population of some of the districts in Assam which border with Bangladesh, and they are extremely poor. And one of the very striking feature of these districts is the Muslims are extremely poor in these districts compared to other groups. I have been told that the reason for this, for the poverty in Assam and these districts, is because there's a large-scale migration from Bangladesh, which is taking place from Bangladesh to Assam. Could you comment on this, whether that is the case?
Okay, thank you. This murder of the bloggers are truly isolated events. The Bangladesh society in general is very tolerant. Historically, for the centuries, it's a tolerant society. So these are isolated events, and the government is very serious about it. We are investigating, and they will be brought to book. And regarding this second one, we don't have any information regarding migration of people from Bangladesh to other countries. This could be the case in the past, before independence. But now, in recent years, this did not take place. Although I know there's some perception about this. And with regard to say that poverty could be a reason for any, of course, poverty could be a reason for migration, but in Bangladesh, one of the good things about the development in Bangladesh is that it has been inclusive development. And regional disparities had been adequately addressed. If you visit Bangladesh, go to Bangladesh, you will see this, the benefit of development has been distributed across the country. For example, the northwest part of the country was perceived underdeveloped for many, many years. But now the situation is totally different. With construction of the Jamuna Bridge, the northwestern part of Bangladesh is as developed as the other parts of the country. The northeast part, the Sylhet, from where you hail from, in fact, Sylhet was a case of disparity. Some people had been like him, had been very rich and highly educated and cultured, and the majority were very highly underdeveloped. But now the case is no longer like this. So all classes of the society has been have received the benefit of development. So the reason for migration for poverty is not the case.
Another interjection now. Yes, there were cases of migration in the 1930s, in particular from Mymensingh to Assam, and which led to the spike of the Muslim population in Assam. And people like Maulana Bhashani and all that sort of thing led those movements. There was a reaction in Assam called the Bengal Kheda movement, which is drive out Bengalis, which meant West Bengalis as well as the Bengalis from Mymensingh. But over time, you see, as Bangladesh, as you say, has developed, this has very severely declined, so much so that there aren't that kind of contacts between Assam and Sylhet and Assam and Tripura anymore. Another interesting data now is that, there are 50,000 Bangladeshis who can opt legally now to go to India after the exchange of enclaves. But apparently, this is not happening. I mean, they are preferring choosing to live in Bangladesh rather than go to India, West Bengal, etc. So that has surprised many analysts who used to argue that there are major migrations from Bangladesh to India. Yes, Bangladeshis like to travel, and they do, and they go to the Middle East and they go to England and America, but not necessarily to West Bengal and Assam. And as for Sylhet, as we were discussing during lunch, Sylhet was not covered by the Permanent Settlement Act of 1793, and therefore, in the 19th century, Sylhet was a part of Assam itself, and there was no tenancy protection acts that extended to Sylhetis, which is why the societal cleavage was very sharp between the Chaudhries and the peasants, because the Chaudhries collected as much as they could from the peasants and paid what's it called, not the rent, but what's it called, the revenue to the state rather than rent. So there was exploitation. Of course, that doesn't happen anymore because now the legislation is equitous and all are equal under law. Okay. Final.
Sylhet was part of Assam until 47.
Yeah, Sylhet was part. In fact, yesterday Professor Ludden in the Malaya gave a seminar on Sylhet in the 18th century. We missed it, but Dr. Sindapal will give me the papers he's promised me. Yes, Professor Mukherjee, the last word.
Fascinating presentation, and especially because I am interested in development in India and Bangladesh, especially Bangladesh, because I have already begun some work on West Bengal. And my earlier work was on industrialization and the regulation of industrialization, and I'm now working more on welfare politics. Now I have two questions. The first is that in the case of India, I find both at the central level as well as at the level of state governments, that what you ended your lecture with is a very, very pertinent point, which I think political scientists miss out, and which is why the state is understudied in South Asia. Because in South Asia, it's very good to be a social movement scholar, a sociologist, but not somebody who studies the state. But what is happening, I find, in India is, whether it is economic reforms or whether it is, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, where it is successfully implemented, the relationship between the bureaucracy, which is the technocratic, sometimes which has a technocratic element to it. It may be a generalist bureaucracy, it may be a At any rate, I think bureaucracy is technocratic because it develops a rationality about conceiving programs and implementing them. And then there is the political executive, the chief minister or the prime minister, depending on what kinds of policies that you're talking about. And increasingly, I am coming to believe, and I am proposing this in my published work, that unless we understand the relationship between the bureaucracy and the political executive, we will not be able to understand the success of development in South Asia. That does not mean that the bureaucracy always does it right. That does not mean that the political executive always does it right. But what you ended your lecture with is a very, very pertinent point, that oftentimes it is the bureaucracy that convinces the political executive. This does not sound constitutionally right, but oftentimes, if you really study policy processes, you begin to learn this. And at the same time, this is not anti-democratic, because I have made this presentation in many parts of the world, and often this question is asked, are you becoming anti-democratic? It is not anti-democratic, because ultimately the political chief executive has to clear it. I mean, without the political chief executive, there is no policy and there is no implementation. So even if the bureaucracy has that kind of a role to play, it has to pass muster with people who have been elected. So it cannot, by definition, be anti-democratic, even if the technocratic rational arm of the government is actually doing a lot of the work. Now, I mean, this is a kind of a long question, but I'm just wondering whether you can give us one example of where a relationship of this kind between the bureaucracy and the political chief executive in Bangladesh produced a good institution or a good policy that had a transformative impact in Bangladesh. That's question number one. The second thing that strikes me is that in the case of India, we do talk about India being a democracy, that non-governmental organizations are very, very important. But time after time after time in my research and the research of my students, I keep coming to the conclusion that the state is very important. But when we look at Bangladesh and India, it still seems to me that the balance of power in terms of action on the ground is probably a little bit more with society than it is with state, because you probably don't have a Grameen Bank in India, you don't have a BRAC in India. Would you be able to reflect on perhaps the importance of social actors in Bangladesh? I mean, not to undermine the importance of the state and the earlier relationship, because it seems to me that Bangladesh is a very interesting case of a very proactive society where actually macro level achievements can happen to a much greater extent as a result of non-state actors than has been the case in India. I don't know whether I'm confusing myself or not.
So,
No,
it's very
you may
clear.
be confusing the speaker, not yourself.
It's very
But
clear.
Anyway, you go ahead and we'll also interject.
Okay, thank you. The first one. You're an academician, so you know better. I'm going to share my ideas about this politics administration dichotomy. Ideally, the political leadership is to provide, is to make policies, and bureaucrats are to implement those. But in reality, I think that's not only reality. So another part of the issue is bureaucracy is also there to provide policy advice, because of the institutional memory, the information available with the bureaucracy, clear knowledge about the system and the process and the procedures and possible implications. Bureaucracy is in a position to provide policy advice. And I don't think it's bad or any harmful for democracy, because the final decision will be made by the political leadership. So in this manner, bureaucracy can play a proactive role in pursuing reform agenda, or even pursuing governance reforms. The other question, to give concrete examples of how bureaucracy played a proactive role. In recent past, at least three things I have mentioned. One is national integrity strategy. Let me tell you that the UNCSC was signed by Bangladesh during the caretaker regime, which was a non-party, non-political, neutral government. And when the draft was placed before the cabinet, I was still Secretary ERD at the time, but I was involved in the process because I was a member of the Secretary's Committee on Administrative Reforms. It was outright rejected by the cabinet, outright rejected. Prime Minister said that, look, this is a product of the caretaker government. This is a product of the civil society and NGOs. Where is the involvement of the political actors? Where is the involvement of the elected representatives of the people? Were the MPs adequately consulted or not? So it was outright rejected. Then the then cabinet secretary and some of us consulted what to do, because as I said also, the minutes is written by the cabinet secretary, and I advised the cabinet secretary to put it in this way: don't close it here. Bring it. This shouldn't be written like this. This should be brought back to the cabinet after due consultations with the elected representatives of the people. And then I joined as cabinet secretary. I led the process. I was instrumental behind it. Now, initially the ministers were very skeptical about this. They thought that this document could backfire. Even some of the members of the cabinet told me, look, don't go ahead with this. This document will be used because it will be challenging to implement, and this document will be used against us to highlight our failure. So don't go ahead with this. So I'll not go into details. Finally, this document came to the cabinet thrice. The second time it was brought before after consultations with the MPs and other stakeholders, and we invited the Speaker of the Parliament to attend the consultation as chief guest. Then it was, cabinet decided to set up a cabinet committee to examine the draft. Then we pursued the matter with the cabinet committee. Finally, it was brought to cabinet again. It was approved. Now, here, some of the bureaucrats played a very important role in pursuing this issue, national integrity strategy. And it's basically a political document, And the second one is the government performance management system. In fact, it was not a top-down decision, rather it was a bottom-up decision. We gathered experiences from other countries, and we prepared the outline, and we were able to convince the Prime Minister and Minister that look, you have a vision, you have a program that has to be implemented. Ministries are doing it in a scattered manner. How to measure it? Whether we are performing our job, you must evaluate. We must provide you with feedback whether we are at all performing or not towards implementation. So finally, they took it positively. And the third one, the ICT, Digital Bangladesh. All the programs, they are mostly conceived by the bureaucrats, and when we can convince the leadership that yes, this will add to the popularity or credibility or acceptability of the government through enhanced performance, then they accept it. So these are the examples. Now the second part of the intervention, NGOs. Of course, at times there are some tensions between the government and the civil society or NGOs, but finally it works, because as I mentioned, the NGOs work in two ways. One, in some cases, in health, in primary education, in poverty reduction, they work the implementing agent of the government programs. So they have the advantage of going to the grassroots. Although government has also, a network at the grassroots level, but there's a limitation. So NGOs with their flexible organizations and groups, they can go to the grassroots, and this is how, and most of the NGO programs are also aligned with the government priorities. But tension arises when some of the NGOs start speaking in a political language. This creates some discomfort for the government. Otherwise, so far they implement the programs aligned with the government priorities. That works very well, and this is how the partnership worked. Health delivery, health, primary education,
Yeah, that is true. I mean, the bureaucracy is like a Weberian status group that is playing a sort of a category that's playing a positive role. You mentioned some reform initiatives by the bureaucracy. Say during our government, like the UNCSC was something that I was very deeply involved with because I came from the UN system. And I thought here was an opportunity, we thought, for us to be in office, say, 2 years. That was the maximum we had given ourselves. So the idea was to put as many positive things on the statute book as possible, knowing full well that these would have to be totally, entirely reviewed by the political system, the next political system. But we realized that some of it would survive. And we realized that some of it which would command some kind of a political support from the broad populace would survive, as did the UNCSC ultimately, as you explained, and the Human Rights Commission. Earlier on, it had taken 15 years, and I was in Geneva working towards it and nothing had happened in the setting up of the National Human Rights Commission. When we had the opportunity, and Human Rights Commission, as you know, constrains the police and that kind of thing, we went ahead and did it. Eventually, it was knocked back. After some time, there has been now some kind of a Human Rights Commission, not perfect perhaps, but we didn't expect it to be, but nonetheless, it is there. So something that we had worked towards for about 20 years, 15 years before us and 5 years since, is there because we took the political, we had the political courage to put it in the book, knowing full well that it would be challenged. And because of the support of the broad bureaucratic system, we were able to do that, and that has sustained. Yes, Pasha? Oh, you wanted the last? Okay.
Actually, I just had one comment.
Yeah.
Sorry, my name is Pasha Mahmood. I teach the business school here. So I was thinking about the.
I
was thinking about the migration from Bangladesh to Assam. So please forgive my ignorance because I really don't know much about this. But I was just thinking, if you look at the difference between per capita income between Bangladesh and India, the difference is not much, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah. That is what I was explaining.
And if it is true that the variation in GDP per capita across the different provinces in Bangladesh is not very wide, that means we don't have a huge disparity in income, whether they're from Mymensingh or from Sylhet. So if Assam is a lot more richer, let's say, compared to Delhi or
Which
Mumbai,
is not a fact.
which is not a fact, I really don't see how it would be economically viable, economically attractive destination for a Bangladeshi to move from Bangladesh to Assam. Again, this is just out of my limited knowledge. I think it could be a political statement often made by respective quarters to say why we haven't taken care of the Muslims in our own communities.
Yeah, in fact, I agree with you. And there's another point. In fact, migration took place 2 or 3 generations ago.
Yeah, that's right.
That's
Yeah,
the point.
in the 30s.
In the 30s, yeah. Migration took place.
Recently, there was this case of this Bengali politician who turned up in Assam, in Shillong and all that, and many journalists thereafter followed him, etc. And they came back with very strange reports about Shillong. They said, oh, this is a place where there are no restaurants, there are no, what's it called, SIM cards available and all that sort of thing. So their impression of Shillong, which is the most developed of these northeast state capitals, they had. I'm saying that some of these views were a bit colored because they didn't have enough social interactions, unlike Sylhetis. But these were sort of non-Sylheti Bengali journalists. But they had very poor perceptions of the quality of life in the northeast. You see, so they wouldn't go to the northeast. You're absolutely right, and that's the point I was making. If they go out at all, yeah, they can come to South India, but that would be to the fire immediately without going through the frying pan at all. Okay, all right. Yes, the Senior Associate Director of ISAS.
I think the Singapore government has been quite involved in training the PMO on e-government and all of that. I remember there's a group called EGL in Institute of System Science that provides. I think the first question I have is to what extent? Yes. So to what extent is this e-government initiative does it dovetail with your national performance benchmarks? Because technology is a key instrument of both monitoring as well as delivering some of the outcomes. That's question one. Question two is that we all know that policy is while the politicians claim that they make policy, end of the day, the bureaucrats have a way of either implementing it or not implementing it, or implementing it in a way that it fails. So I would just like to have a, so sometimes it's very stupid to ask why a policy failed, whether it's conceived in the wrong fashion or it's, by the time people find that out, governments change. So my real question is, in your framework of the key performance indicators, what are these and what are they meant to achieve?
Okay. In fact, with regard to ICT, in the broader policy framework, we'd like to use ICT as a means, not an end in itself. So ICT is going to play a very important role in implementing various policies undertaken in various sectors, including the government performance management system, the grievance redress mechanism system. All this will be ICT based, but not absolutely ICT based, because initially we have to keep it open for different citizens. Now the other one is regarding how the format, the structure of the annual performance agreement. I don't have any copy of any model agreement. I wished I could have, but I somehow forgot to take it with me. Here, it's ministry specific. For example, in education, they have to set the broad goals, and to reach those goals, what activities would be needed, and these activities, they have to phase it out against the timeline, and they will and there are many activities, and there are assigned marks for each of the activities, and these are evaluated against this achievement. This is the broad framework, and these activities that have to be that has to be undertaken in a given year, and the progress that has been made against this set goal is measured actually. This thing.
So it's a very activity-based kind of performance.
Yeah, not only activity, but it's a deductive process. Yeah, there are the vision, mission, then functions of the ministry, activities, then you come to the activities, and also the evaluation criteria or the marks, and at the end, how far you have. But you have to link the activities with the set objectives. That's the thing.
So who gets penalized if the goals are not met? Is it the bureaucrat or the minister?
Good question. Right at this stage, we would not like to focus on punishment rather, or even gradually. No. That's as you know. This if you perform, then you will get recognition, and if you do not perform, you will be branded as non-performer. This is the beginning.
The ministry itself.
Yeah, but both minister and the secretary both.
This is naming and shaming.
Naming and shaming.
So
Yeah.
everyone is
All right. We have already 20 minutes past our time, and this just shows how interesting the discussion was, and because this time went almost unnoticed. Musharraf, I want to thank you for your contribution in advancing our understanding of the way the Bangladesh system works, governance works. As you can see, there is very deep interest in Bangladesh, not only in this country, but in this family, in ISA's family. We wish you and your government every success. And as a token of our appreciation for the time you spent with us, we want to leave you with some reading material.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, High Commissioner, for coming with your